Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Krugman, professor at the City University of New York and an independent newsletter writer on Substack. You might have noticed that I'm not Soumaya Keynes, host of the Economics Show podcast. I'm here with Soumaya, as well as her longtime collaborator, Chad Bown, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, formerly chief economist at the U.S. State Department. Together, these two have just written a book called How to Win a Trade War. And today we're going to be asking just that. How do you win a trade war? Soumaya, Chad, hi.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
So, yeah. Actually, maybe I can start by asking a slightly funny question, which is, who are you? Not who. I know you're Chad and Soumaya, but when we talk about how to win a trade war, who is this? Who's the audience? Presumably not actually Donald Trump. It's probably not Xi Jinping. Who should be, now, I mean, everybody should read it, but who do you think might, in some sense, read it, or at least be briefed on people who've read it?
Well, look, if Donald Trump wants to read the book, then we are very willing to sign a copy. We'll hand deliver it however he wants a copy. And, the conceit of the book is that you, the reader, are really interested in fighting a trade war, right? And we are the two nerdy, kind of reluctant guides saying, if you really want to do it, then, we'll give you the evidence that you need. We'll tell you everything there is to know, because this is, it's not easy to fight and win a trade war. And so, at least arm yourself with the evidence of what's happened in the past, what works, what doesn't work. And so, we kind of acknowledge that most readers may come to this not actually wanting to fight a trade war, right? So the point is it's to help people understand, how to navigate this world of economic conflict, as I feel like, many people have become unwilling participants in these massive, massive geopolitical conflicts. It can be a bit bewildering. And so, the book is really supposed to be for everyone, right? To understand how we got here and where we go next.
Okay, because I found myself thinking that it was easier somehow to follow the line of argument is to think of my, still a little bit of delusions of grandeur, but imagine myself to be Mark Carney or Prime Minister of Canada, or to imagine myself as Ursula von der Leyen making policy for the EU. But basically, you've got these two powers that, in different ways, we've got the United States, which is basically Donald Trump, and we've got China, which is a little bit more of an institutional thing. But they are certainly waging something that they consider trade wars, and what are the first? Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about how do we get here? How did we get to this point? And I think if we were holding this conversation around 10 years ago, it mostly would have been, well, we're economists, we understand free trade is great. Maybe 15 years ago, even more so, and so the answer is just don't do this free trade. So how I think all three of us probably have had some visions on the road to Damascus about why that isn't an adequate approach. Anybody want to start off on that?
Maybe I'll take a stab first. So I guess to answer the question, we have to talk about what trade war we could or should be fighting, because there are, I think, arguably multiple trade wars happening right now. You've got President Trump doing a lot of things, but behind that, there's another really big trade war that's happening, and that's the one having to do with China. So let me start there. I would say, and it's not as if I noticed this at the time, but say in 2015, when China rolled out its Made in China 2025 strategy, industrial policy that said, we're going to have these market share targets to dominate certain important sectors of the future. That was kind of a sign that China was thinking about things differently than I think other traditional United States and others had been. And then you fast forward a couple of years with Xi Jinping and his dual circulation strategy, more clearly articulating the idea that China did not want to be interdependent with the rest of the world. It wanted the rest of the world to be dependent on China for their supply chain, so the United States to be dependent on China for sourcing stuff, but China to not have dependencies on the rest of the world. And when you start to think about a functioning trading system, as we've lived in for, in the post-war period since the late 1940s, it requires rules, all those things, but it also fundamentally requires a willingness to be interdependent. right? And to trust that I'm going to export to you, you're going to import to me, and yeah, there'll be sometimes some frictions, but by and large, that will be okay. And China was saying, no, we want to have an asymmetric relationship where we want to do what we want to do, but we're not all that interested in what you want to do. So for me, it was kind of seeing those things that really made me think that, the world has changed. We're in some sort of trade war, and really China is the part that's driving this.
So my journey, I think, there was an important moment for me in the first Trump administration, right? And so, Trump ran onto the scene during his first term and started throwing tariffs at China predominantly. Chad and I had this podcast about trade, and we were the loudest voices saying, what are you doing? You've got to play by the rules. Why not try to use the rule book to solve these underlying structural problems that we have with China? I was covering trade full time at that time. And, something that was happening behind the scenes was that there were efforts to try and get some kind of coordinated plan to save the rules-based system, to try and solve some of the structural problems between China and the US by writing new rules. So you had these trilateral discussions between the US, Japan, and the EU. And the idea was, okay, well, why don't we just write out the way in which we want China to behave, limits on subsidies, new ways of protecting ourselves against China's subsidies. And the idea was, they would agree on that common plan. Then they might go to China and say, hey, look, we've got some new rules. You sign up to these, and look, President Trump will drop his tariffs. Now, that was the hope of some involved in that process. It certainly wasn't Donald Trump's plan. And I think, a very fundamental way in which I have moved on from that is I just don't believe that the solution to these problems lies in a new set of common rules that everyone is going to sign up to, right? In fact, the Trump administration did go to the Chinese government with a list of requirements or requests in terms of, China's subsidy behavior, and the Chinese, shredded it, right? They weren't going to change their system. And so, that's really the backdrop to where we are today, which is, the Trump administration, I think pretty much most everyone else has given up on the idea that the rules are going to save us. And that is kind of scary. It's a bit, it means that we can't rely on the rule book to predict what's going to happen next. It's a much more chaotic, power-based world, and we're kind of feeling our way through.
Yeah, that's a... Yeah, for what it's worth, I've had sort of two moments of revelation about trade. One of them, which seemed terribly relevant, but maybe a little less so now, was the work early 2010s on the China shock, where we started to realize that, hey, the problems of adjustment and dislocation that come from rapid globalization are a lot bigger than, economists have always understood that there were distributional issues, but they're a lot bigger, and that was revelatory and a bit of a shock. But I think it's actually not the core of the story now. And for me, the revelation was, it's a little odd, but I'm going to give you a really offbeat point at which I realized that we're not getting this back, which was actually when Russia invaded Ukraine. When we realized, hey, this rules-based order, not just about trade, but everything, is not the future, that we are not going to live in a world where we sort of had taken it for granted that all of the old stuff, all of the old demons had been banished. We weren't going to have outright war in Europe. We weren't going to have countries just plain exploiting their powers over trade for geopolitical gain. And we now realize, I think I realized that, hey, all the things that we thought were fundamentals about the 21st century economy were actually basically dependent upon a benevolent hegemon. Not totally benevolent, not totally hegemonic, but still a lot of it depended upon basically the United States, which enforced the rules and obeyed its own rules for the most part. And, well, we're not in that world anymore. Not in Kansas anymore, among other places. And yeah, so it's a much tougher world out there.
Can I just add that I think economists have been on a sort of journey as well, right? The starting point being, your your theory, right? So, we thought that one of the benefits of trade was, agglomeration, right? Huge efficiencies, huge economies of scale, that, created these gains from trade. And what we've seen now, I think, is that those agglomeration benefits are real, but in a world where we're not friends with everyone and we don't trust everything, they come with risk, right? So, yeah, I mean, do you feel like, where do you feel like economics has gone?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In some ways, the models were already there, and we understood that there are big advantages to agglomeration, although I think they've turned out to be even bigger than we realized. And they really do, I've been writing my own little journey here about Europe versus the United States, and an astonishing amount of that is driven by, loosely speaking, the fact that Silicon Valley is on the U.S. side of the Atlantic, right? It's just that there are some agglomerations which color all of the numbers, but in a world of open markets, agglomeration rules, okay, we don't, Texas doesn't obsess about the fact that California controls a lot of the IT sector. Why should Europe obsess about the fact that the United States controls a lot of it? But that was not the world that we're living in now, where these things become very real. So the whole, everything changes once you stop assuming that fundamentally it doesn't matter where stuff is produced. And of course, in a way, the bigger one, we're talking a lot about high tech, but if we talk about Chinese manufacturing is all of these. It's not just that China is good at a lot of stuff. China has a whole industrial ecosystem that gives them tremendous amount of leverage in the world. I mean, China isn't the only place that has rare earth deposits, but it's the only place that has the industrial ecosystem that can process them at this point. And so that altogether, that creates a world of where, I don't know what, Section 232 and Article, I think Article 21 of the GATT, the national security, there we see with the chat, and I'm always testing my acronyms and numbers knowledge. But anyway, I thought, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, well, all this national security stuff, that's just an excuse. National security is the last refuge of a scoundrel. But actually not.
Yep.
So, okay. Any further thought, any other sort of revelations beyond the fact that it's a scary world with nasty people in it?
So I have one, which is, you mentioned the China shock literature, right? And so, this is this collection of papers showing the effects of imports from China. Right. And, one paper that I thought was super interesting that came up as we were researching this book was about what happened in Canada, right? When there was liberalization as part of was it NAFTA or was it
CUSTA, yeah,
CUSTA.
The one before it.
Yeah.
So the predecessor to NAFTA. And actually, this research found that the effects were really quite dissimilar from those China shock effects. People were able to adjust. There were export opportunities created by that trade deal. People moved into those other industries. There's also research looking at trade liberalization and populism in Europe, right? And there seems to be this relationship between places that have stronger social safety nets and the switch to right-wing parties. And so, I think one point that I would want to make is, it's important not to go to overinterpret what's going on now and to kind of see it as this idea that, all trade liberalization, has losers and there's just nothing we can do to address those, right? There are cases where actually import liberalization, we could cope okay with it, and economies adjusted and social safety nets worked. So I think it's important not to kind of overcorrect after some of those instances where there was real pain in the past.
Actually, I'm trying to remember how much in the book you really talk about the political economy of the protectionist backlash, because that is actually, it's not as, there was a simple story, trade produces lots of losers and now the public won't have it. And that's not actually the story, as far as I can make out. What did you say? I'm trying to remember the actual way you put it.
Chad, do you remember, or shall I?
No, yeah. The story is that it's complicated, right? And voters don't, kind of respond as cleanly as one might expect to what the economic implications are for them, right? And so one of the more recent China shock papers, in fact, has looked at the longer run impacts of the China shock on, and the reapplication of the tariffs in the first Trump administration, and has found that they didn't really do the job of, helping workers in those regions, right? Didn't improve employment or anything like that. But it did help President Trump's party in subsequent elections, right? So there is maybe something to the idea that, well, okay, he may not be helping me, get a better job or my employment process, but at least he's fighting on my behalf, right? And so what that means is it's really messy to draw these links between all of this stuff in the political economy context.
Okay, that's really, I didn't know that. I somehow missed that. I know you did mention it, but it was, that it's not so much, if you look at kind of the vector of real wage changes or whatever, of employment changes, that's not really the story. It's more about attitudes, sense of whether you're led by somebody who's standing up to foreigners. That's a, because I was going to say that, there wasn't that much of, I think in the end, the protectionism in the U.S. and I think in Europe is not really a mass public groundswell. There are parties who exploit it, but it's not really, this sort of simple, deterministic, losers fight back, and this is why we have a problem. A lot of it more has to do with, again, the complexities of the political process.
Yeah, and so you can see this in both what's going on in the US and also the EU. So if you think about what Trump did, right, he had to do this by using and arguably abusing, arcane bits of US law, because he didn't have the support of Congress to apply these tariffs, right? And so he kind of ran roughshod over the democratic process there. Obviously in the case of IEPA, that turned out to be overturned by the Supreme Court. During the first Trump administration, companies were complaining quite a lot. I think during the second, those complaints were a little quieter. That's probably some combination of, worrying about retribution, but also maybe in some cases they adapted, right? And so I think one lesson of that episode could be that you may not have the constituents for protection at the beginning, but you could develop those constituents if that protection is there for long enough. And then the contrast is with what's going on in Europe right now, right? There's a huge discussion about whether the EU should essentially do more of what the US is doing and protect itself. And it's just extraordinarily difficult, even though you've got these really acute problems, right? German exporters being, crushed in third markets, the car industry really struggling to cope with that Chinese competition. And even then, right, even in the face of these really extreme Chinese export trends, even then it's really, really difficult to get a consensus, right? And so, it's a question of, can Europe ever act as decisively as the Trump administration? That maybe there's a middle ground between kind of hopeless inaction and kind of maybe overaction. But yeah, that just speaks to that issue.
Okay, we could go on. I actually just say quickly, the importance of pesky institutional details, including the details of legislation that people wrote decades ago that were not intended for the purposes to which it's being applied. It's amazing. I mean, the fact that Section 122 is written the way it is, and that IEPA is written the way it is, suddenly turned out to be, the fate of the world is hinging on more or less accidental wording of decades-old legislation. It's kind of amazing.
I was outraged when an economist, the economics correspondent at The Economist magazine, I started, covering trade. I thought this was going to be all about, big intellectual battles of which model worked best. And actually, I essentially became a lawyer, working out,
Right.
What does the Section 301 statute mean? What's 232? How is this compatible with the World Trade Organization rules? You get stuck in the legalese quite quickly. But as you say, these details really, really matter. So apologies for all of the lawyers. I'm not actually a lawyer.
I knew somebody who taught a trade policy course long ago, but she would return term papers with the just right at the top, YHTMAAAIYP, which was, you have too many acronyms and abbreviations in your paper. So anyway, so you're, what, you know, so we're talking about Europe responding, taking the extreme constraints on European action, you know, how would you go to, you know, you go to the Berlaymont in Brussels and you're going to tell the European Commission, here's what you should do in response to, I think you called the America as a pirate and China as a warship, but anyway, so these two quite different but very seriously threatening aggressive trade policy partners. The two of the world's three economic superpowers are not behaving the way they used to, and you're, you know, the most obvious case is, okay, you're sort of running the third power. What should you be doing?
Well, engaging, right? And I think, you know, as Soumaya indicated, Europe has been a little bit slow to engage in the, you know, can we fight a trade war question? But they do seem to be there now. One of the really interesting, you know, front lines for Europe at the moment is this issue of electric vehicles and the automotive sector. And what's fascinating is the following. They're essentially trying to see if they can learn from the Chinese model to encourage Chinese firms to build cars in Europe, right? So what was the Chinese model? The Chinese model was forced technology transfer. What made them successful at the time, or partly what made them successful, was, you know, back in the early 2000s, there were a lot of Western automakers in the United States, Japan, Korea, Europe, that all wanted access to China's 1.4 billion potential drivers, right? And China had high tariffs at the time, so exporting into China was really hard. China said, we want you to build those cars here. And not only do we want you to build those cars here, but we want you to form joint ventures with local Chinese firms and then teach them effectively how to make cars themselves, right? And they were successful. And part of the reason why they were successful, you know, we think, is there were lots and lots of these Western automakers competing against each other, all seeking to get access to that Chinese market. So you fast forward today and you say, well, okay, can Europe do the same thing with respect to the Chinese technological leaders today in battery electric vehicles? And while there may be, you know, at the moment, lots and lots and lots of EV manufacturers in China, BYD is the dominant one. And behind that is the battery makers, which are BYD and CATL, right? And to try to sort of thwart that possibility, right? The idea that, well, maybe Europe could exploit, you know, divisions amongst Chinese firms and negotiate to get them to come into Europe, partner with German automakers, teach them how to make battery electric vehicles better, locate production here, create lots of jobs. The Chinese government has already set up a system of licensing for its technology and saying, no, BYD, CATL, you know, these companies, you're not allowed to just go out and negotiate with the Europeans. We're going to be the one. The Chinese government is going to be the one controlling access to that technology from foreigners, right? So in one hand, you have the Europeans maybe seeking to learn from the Chinese model, and the other hand, you know, the Chinese are already going a step beyond and saying, yeah, we're not going to let you learn from our model and get those jobs there in Europe. Here's how we're going to thwart those kinds of things.
Wow, and that's really instructive, because, you know, I guess all of us, you know, spent years learning about why government intervention in trade is almost always a bad thing, and how letting people buy wherever they want and certainly not blocking possible profitable opportunities is clearly going to hurt your country. And now we're sort of saying, oh, you know, this dirigist overall control. And in this case, it's not just geopolitical. It's, well, you know, China can preserve its effectively its technology advantage, even though it's not fancy technology, but it's still and because they can close off technology transfer. That makes it sound like, well, okay, is there? So, but you're saying that basically, as I understand it, that at least the EU, presumably other Mark Carney's middle powers, need to be at least a little bit more like the Chinese, have more of a sort of let's think about this from a national interest point of view.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, one of the lessons that we took away from the book is we all need to learn a lot from each other, from the other players, but especially, I think in the Western system, we need to learn from China. That does not mean we need to adopt the Chinese model, right? And so please don't get me wrong and by thinking that we're not. But there are elements of what China does when it does industrial policy, when it does, in that earlier example, the transfer of technology, that if you want to have those similar kind of outcomes be successful, you really do need to see what it was about the Chinese system that allowed them to be successful in those instances. You may not be able to replicate it, right? So you need to learn those kinds of lessons as well. But yes, learn important lessons from China.
So, I mean, the European EVs in Europe, I mean, the United States has decided that we're going to have coal-burning cars or something, but EVs in Europe there is a question, should they even be trying? Shouldn't they, how does that fit? There is, why not, okay, if the Chinese are going to sell you cheap electric vehicles, why not just drive cheap electric vehicles and work on your European comparative advantage, whatever that may be.
I mean, this is actually a debate in the US, right? You've got some saying, why won't you let me buy a cheap EV? These things are, karaoke bars on wheels. I want a piece of that equipment. And, I think there are, the arguments against are, include one, this is actually an area where Chad and I had quite heated debate as we were writing the book, as Chad was much more in favor of banning things than I was. And, that relates to some of the security risks around, having Chinese software run some of these vehicles, the risks of surveillance, even being able to turn off the car remotely. Chad was more gung-ho about banning vehicles because of that concern than I was. I wanted, surely it's possible to come up with some kind of technical test, because if we start banning cars on that basis, then what about smartphones, right? Last time I checked, there was quite a lot of electronic equipment that was made in China that could, in theory, carry the same risks. So are we really going to be inconsistent? So there's the security piece of that. There's also just the political economy piece of that, right? Which is that, the car industry is massively important in Europe. The political consequences of letting all of those smaller companies just shut down would be potentially devastating. And then third, there's a kind of bigger argument about industrial capacity. And, when we don't trust each other, is it really wise to be cutting manufacturing or accepting the loss of manufacturing? Could there be some connection to innovation? The evidence on this isn't, something that we explore, but it isn't, as concrete as we'd like. But, is there something, do the folks who worry about manufacturing having some kind of national security advantage, do they have a point, right? In some kind of heated conflict, do you actually need the capacity to scale up quickly? And so actually having that industrial might is important. Now, that doesn't mean manufacturing jobs, but, I'm talking about overall manufacturing.
Yeah. And you wrote the book, obviously, before the Iran war, and but you do talk about supply chains and the threat of cutoffs, and that now seems immensely more real. I mean, how does that change the way we think about trade wars?
So I think Iran and Strait of Hormuz, right? You look at obviously from Iran's perspective, the war, the physical war, the military aspects of it have to be absolutely devastating, right? But at the same time, they have been able to weaponize through their export restrictions, imposed on not allowing things through the Strait of Hormuz in a way that is, orders of magnitude bigger than the size of their economy would otherwise suggest, right? And so that's part of the new world in which we live. Sometimes you have those kinds of supply chain disruptions that can come up by, not recognizing just how serious those choke points are. I think there were a lot of folks that probably did recognize how serious those potential choke points were. But as we have seen, through what's happened since February, the world is now, facing the consequences of those actions.
So just building on that, I think what we've seen so far with the Strait of Hormuz is that some of those disruptions haven't hit yet. And that's because companies have been doing, one of the policies we discuss in the book, which is stockpiling, right? So we've had inventories and they've been running them down. So, when the crisis first started, folks were asking how bad could this get? And the response was, well, as long as it doesn't last for very long, it'll be okay, right? Because there are those buffers. And so, the crisis, I think, highlights the importance of having those buffers. But also, I think that, there is a point about substitution. So if you think about the drop in oil flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz, a third of that has been made up with oil flowing out through other ports, right? And so one of the lessons here is that, when thinking about your vulnerabilities, actually, there's always some slack in the system. There are always some opportunities for substitution. They may not be, fast, it may not be easy, but actually one of the lessons from history in extreme situations is that we tend to be a bit more adaptable than we sometimes fear. That said, obviously, if this disruption goes on, there's real pain being felt, right? We shouldn't then swing too far in the other direction and say, oh, well, there's no point in applying export controls because we can always adapt away. That's not true. And as we are seeing now in some of the poorer countries who are on the front end of this, and as we will be seeing later, these weapons are pretty impactful and pretty dangerous.
What struck me, though, is the Strait of Hormuz is it's a physical choke point, which is helpful for illustrating the concept, but it turns out there are all of these de facto choke points, like rare earths, like, semiconductors. It's not that so much stuff passes through the Strait of Taiwan. It's the fact that basically everything runs on chips made in this island. So yeah, and you do talk about this. Right there is definitely a case for policies that, even at some cost, make sure that you have that critical stuff is made in some quantity in places that are less subject to this kind of. I don't think. For many years I was co-author of the best-selling international economics textbook. I don't think we mentioned supply chains, export controls, any of that. I think I probably haven't yet. I probably have to get that in the next edition.
No, don't worry.
Anyway,
you don't have to. You can just assign our book as the top up.
That's right.
Definitely. Then it'll be fine. YUHTMAAAYP. No, you're actually very good. I'm not doing the acronyms and the numbers, but it is something. Actually, I'll give a quick quiz. Do you know the answer? You probably do, but all these numbered trade things. What act are they numbers from? 1974? Well, the answer is they're from several different acts. Okay, well, that was a trick question.
We've got a 122 and a 232, and they're not from the same law, so it's totally obscure. Anyway.
Okay. Should we wrap up here?
Well, let me just ask the last question, then I'll let you go. Do you have a view? How does this pan out? You've given some good advice to people who are not Donald Trump, effectively. Maybe Trump would benefit from it, but he's not going to read it, and probably not Xi Jinping. But how do you think this shakes out? It's possible that Mark Carney and his middle powers, or Ursula von der Leyen and the EU leadership, will in fact think about these issues and quite possibly read your book, as they should. What does the world look like in 5 years?
Okay, well, look, I'm going to be real. I don't think there's going to be some grand bargain in the next 5 years, right? Which goes back to my point earlier about the rules aren't going to save us. And that's, those underpinned the stability that we had for so long, right? That's really the only, outcome that would reduce the chaos, right? And so without that, we're kind of in this messy world where everyone is going to be following this rule book that we've laid out. Everyone's going to be trying to stockpile, to subsidize, to look to see what everyone else is doing, to see what lessons they can learn. That's going to be pretty chaotic, I think, because, the chances are that there's going to be, misinterpretation of what's happening. So just, take an example. Stockpiling is one of the main tools that countries are now deploying to try to protect themselves against, weaponized shortages. But, there was a hearing not too long ago where one of the US committee was quizzing experts on whether stockpiling was a sign that a country was about to attack, right? You've got China building up massive stockpiles. What if that breeds suspicion that there's some kind of military preparation? And what if Western stockpiling breeds that suspicion on the other side, right? So you have this real risk of these awful self-fulfilling dynamics. So, do all the nice things, right? Communicate, try to coordinate with your friends, engage, be as transparent as you can, put in the effort, spend the money, subsidize stockpile, do all of the things that are hard. But, you're going to have to put in the effort and be consistent about it. Because, the dynamics are such that in a trade war, your adversary is going to be, taking advantage of any moment of weakness to try to strengthen their position.
And I would say for me, the only things I would add to that is, to build upon please work with your partners and allies, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be fighting with them and distracting them away from the really hard task at hand of fighting the real trade war that needs to be fought, which is dealing with these challenges with China. And every ounce of time that Europe or Canada or Japan or Korea has to deal with American tariffs, demands for, invest here in my energy sector or something like that, instead of focusing on how do we most quickly, at lowest cost possible, to deal with the affordability concerns, diversify some of these supply chains away from China while China is actively trying to prevent us from diversifying those supply chains away from us.
Right.
We need to do that kind of thing together. So focus on the trade wars that need to be fought, and let's put the other trade wars to the side.
Okay, that's actually interesting, because you're basically saying that if not full-on conflict, their trade war with China is going to happen, at least a cold trade war, and that if only the United States would stop doing what it's doing, that we could actually form an effective, or might be able to form an effective precautionary block against it, which is optimistic. I guess means that particularly if we get some better management back on the home front, we might actually be able to resolve this not too badly. That's what passes for wild optimism in the year 2026.
We're all optimists now. This is great. Sunny uplands wait.
All right. Well, Soumaya and Chad, thanks so much. Thanks for the book, which is tremendously enlightening, and thanks for the not totally dire analysis at the end. Let's hope for the best, and the best way to make it work is for everybody to read the book.
Great advice.